And welcome to our In Conversation With series, where we'll be talking to experts across the legal sector to discover the mindsets, behaviours, skills and digital tools that are needed to run a successful modern law firm. I'm Amy Bruce, host and marketing manager at Osprey Approach. Today, I'm joined by founder of DG Legal, the largest provider of strategic and compliance services to the legal sector in England and Wales. He's also worked with several government departments, advised dozens of charities, and is a member of the Law Society Leadership and Management Committee. David Gilmore, welcome, David. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you, Amy.
So today we'll be discussing how law firms can ensure a proactive compliance culture within their firm to mitigate risk. We'll cover how to avoid the common compliance pitfalls most firms face and share best practices for mitigating risk. We'll also discuss the software tools that have the biggest impact on compliance, how to stay up to date with changes, and how should firms prepare for the future. But first, David, tell me a little bit more about yourself and your background that's led you to where you are today.
Well, I've got a bit of a mixed background, I suppose. After university, I joined Abbey National as a trainee branch manager and became a manager there, now called Santander, of course. And then I kind of switched sector, went into retail sector and was a store manager for Marks and Spencer and travelled around the country, various locations, mainly London. And then in the late 90s, again, another switch, this time to the Legal Aid Agency, which has actually changed name 3 times. I think it was the Legal Aid Board when I joined, and by the time I left, it became the Legal Services Commission, and then it changed again to, as I said, the Legal Aid Agency. And I left that agency and started my own business, gosh, almost 24 years ago, February 2000. And I have a couple of other businesses as well. One is advising charities, which you've alluded to already. And bizarrely, an electric gates business, which is kind of strange, but keeps me occupied on the 2 days that I'm not working with DG Legal. And there's just over 20 people in the team at DG Legal.
Yeah, I mean, you stuck with the legal sector for the longest, so perhaps that's where, that's exactly why we've got you here today, because you've got so much experience and knowledge to give over. And DG Legal currently have over 180 free practice management and compliance training webinars to tackle common challenges. Is that right?
Yes, it is, Amy. We decided to do free training back in April 2020 because we weren't sure how the legal sector was going to cope with the virus. And we thought that by providing free practice management webinars, it would help. And by the end of the year, we'd had over 5,000 bookings for the 20 webinars that we produced. And then we expanded into doing legal webinars. And I think we're up to about almost 70,000 bookings now. And so, yeah, that's been a nice accident, I think I've put it. We didn't really mean to go into training. It was just going to be a small project, but it kind of took a life on its own, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's definitely a resource to check out for anyone looking to dive deeper into compliance. You have plenty of consultants and great experts over there, so that's always worth checking out. So obviously we're going to dive deeper into some of the areas of compliance today, and hopefully everybody sticks around. But if everyone only has 5 minutes to stay with us, I just want to have a quick top 3 takeaways for listeners, lessons for running a successful modern law firm that you've experienced and have knowledge of over the last few years.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing is to be contactable. I find it very odd that in 2023, there's still most law firms are not responsive after 5 p.m. It seems odd to me. And there are still some law firms that don't answer the phone at lunchtimes, which is even odder. I think lunchtimes is probably the most important time to be available because that's when potential clients are trying to get hold of you. So I guess that's one thing. And I just want to make another comment about that. I suppose if you cannot answer the phone during the lunchtime for whatever reason, or after 5 p.m, then use a telephone answering agency. Whatever cost involved would be more than mitigated by the additional clients you would get. So that's one, I suppose. Another tip, which I don't think many people talk about very much or particularly aware of, and that is turn your organization chart upside down. So with a traditional organization chart, you'll have the founder or the directors at the top, and then right at the bottom somewhere will be the support staff. To me, the person answering the phone and the receptionist, they are the most important people in a law firm, in my opinion, certainly for a high street law firm, because first impressions really do count. And the way that the phone is answered, the way the potential client is treated, makes all the difference between turning that potential client into a client or not. So I think that's also important. Also, I think some of the better firms I've been to get their staff involved in the business and marketing plan. I've learned from experience that some of the very best suggestions come from support staff. So make sure they're involved. I think time's too short to give you lots of examples, but there have been some pretty spectacular examples. In fact, I will give you just one example. And that there was a law firm in London that asked for suggestions, and a secretary said, well, why don't you give some free advice to the Gurkhas? And this is going back about 12 years ago. And they got one Gurkha in, and then that one person recommended another. And then before you knew it, they were advising several hundred Gurkhas, and they got involved with Joanna Lumley and persuaded the government to change its position on the Gurkhas. So without that suggestion from a secretary, that never would have happened. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And there's a project I just started with a batch of firms where we're trying to get them to take seriously things like Google reviews, Trustpilot, review solicitors, etc. Because a lot of our law firms that do use those sites find that their number of clients has increased, maybe by 100%, etc. And I know one client, he told me that 70% of his clients come via these kind of review websites. So this is why I think it's important. We certainly take Google reviews very seriously. I think we're up to about 1,000 reviews now, so I know that it works. So I think that's probably the key takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all those things are primary and crucial for your brand, and brands are built up outside of logos and colours. They're built out of what you stand for, what your values are, and what your clients and prospect clients think of you. And I think they're all such great ideas of making sure that you build that from the ground up and that everyone's involved and everyone's bought into that. A brand is something that the employees have to buy into and behave against to win those clients and build those relationships. And actually, reputation plays a key part in compliance, because if you have compliance errors or breaches, actually it has detrimental effects, not only financially, but also on your reputation. So that leads me very nicely into my question of what are the key challenges that you feel that SMEs face when it comes to staying compliant? What would you say the top are?
Well, I think the key challenge has to be keeping up with all of the requirements, particularly if you're a small firm. What I mean by that is firms have to think not only about the SRA standards and regulations and the codes of conduct, but they also have to think about the multitude of legislation out there. For example, anti-money laundering, financial sanctions. And then they've got to think about all the other regulators that are relevant to them, such as the ICO and the legal ombudsman, etc. So I think particularly for a sole practitioner, it's incredibly difficult to actually run a law firm and be completely compliant. And then moving on to common pitfalls, I think the most common pitfalls would include not really understanding what firms are expected to do with AML and the SRA transparency rules. On AML, many firms have not carried out an adequate firm-wide risk assessment and or an independent AML audit. And I think that some firms are doing too little, and oddly, some firms are doing too much. So I'll give you an example of a firm doing a little bit too much. So I referred a footballer to a local law firm. This footballer used to play for Leicester City in England, and it's now in the States coaching. And they went overboard in asking him to get a certified copy of his passport and various other documents posted from the States over to England. And really, all they needed to do really would be to just send it electronically and then have a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting and show the documents to the camera. That would have worked. So I think too many firms prefer a flowchart type approach. And in actual fact, you just have to think it through. You know, does this person seem like they were actually a footballer? Did they actually play for Leicester in England? And just using the internet, you'll find, yes, absolutely. So it's just thinking it through about the risk. Whereas if you're dealing with somebody that you've never heard of in a country which might be on what's known as the grey list, etc., where kind of their own regulations aren't as thorough as ours, then you've got to take a lot more care. So, you know, you've got to take a risk-based approach to these things. And I mentioned the transparency rules, which have been around for over 4 years now. SRA have lost patience with firms and are starting to hand out fines. And I think only around about a quarter of firms are actually fully complying with the rules. And most disturbingly, there are many, many firms out there that believe that the rules only apply in certain categories of law. It's just not the case. Other than the price elements of the transparency rules, other bits apply to every firm.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll touch on a little later on how your recommendations for how firms can keep up to date. You mentioned that at the beginning, but like you said, there's so much to get involved in and understand and update, and it's not easy. It's not easy to understand these legislations. It's not easy to understand what's necessary. But I think, like you said, it's taking that risk-based approach of also aligning it with your client experience. Compliance is all about, I spoke to Amy from Till Compliance the other day, and she focused compliance on client care. And I think that's what you're sort of saying there about the client experience, marrying that up, making sure you've got the compliance, but you've also got the client experience to measure that up. So yeah, I get you've touched on the sort of common pitfalls there. The AML, we're seeing all sorts of reports of people not following the right matter risk assessments and all that good stuff, as well as the transparency. So can you share some examples and best practices of how firms what they can implement to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, I suppose the starting point really is getting an understanding of what the COLP and the COFA is supposed to do. So I guess that kind of starts with training. One of the things that we're very conscious of is that the SRA are very keen on what they call outcomes-focused regulation. They're not particularly prescriptive, and it's up to law firms and lawyers to work out a system which is compliant. So I think in practice, what you actually have to do is have a list of kind of central records you need to maintain and checklists for the COLP and the COFA. So for our clients, we ask them to complete one checklist for the COLP, another one for the COFA, so they understand what they're actually supposed to be doing in practice. I mentioned central records. I guess the most important central record about mitigating risks is called the risk register. So a risk register basically sets out all of the different things that can go wrong in a law firm. And the idea is you're supposed to explain what actions you can take to minimize risk or mitigate risk or to avoid the risk altogether. And it's not absolutely mandatory to have a risk register, but if the SRA asked and you didn't have one, I think it'd be quite hard to defend that position. And the other thing, which isn't mandatory, but if a law firm got in trouble, one of the questions the SRA is bound to ask is, did you have a file review process? And was it a proper file review process, or was it a tick box exercise? So a file review process is really about two things. One is looking for elements of compliance. So for instance, was a client care letter sent out promptly to the client? Was a risk check undertaken about the client and the instruction? Was a conflict of interest check taken? So those kind of compliance bits, but then they should also be looking at substantive elements, and by that I mean the legal stuff. So was the advice given correct? Was the action taken appropriate? Etc. etc. So it is a powerful process, because if you do it properly, you're probably going to catch things before they go wrong. So that's 3 examples of best practice, I think.
Yeah, I think it's that proactivity, isn't it? That preparing in advance as much as possible. Things change, obviously things crop up, but as much as you can be prepared and evidence that you're prepared, I think that's a key thing there, to actually evidence to whoever may be asking questions down the line, or whoever wants to ask questions internally of how do I deal with this, being prepared and documented as much as possible.
Absolutely.
You also mentioned 2 key things there that I want to dive into a little bit more, and that was about having a digital sort of central file service, and also making sure these things are followed, and sort of touching on that behaviour. So first I'll touch with the tools. So what digital tools, what software features do you think have the biggest impact? I mean, there's so many out there. Where do firms start, and what tech should definitely be used by co-ops?
Okay, well, I suppose if we went back 20 years, or when I started my business, there wasn't any electronic solutions out there. And in fact, the COP and COFA roles hadn't been invented then. I think they came in around about 2010 time. So law firms used to just keep lever arch folders. They'd have like a central register of complaints, another folder which would be a register of all of their kind of approved suppliers, such as barristers, for instance. And then I think a few years later, more and more law firms started using Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, etc. And to this day, many firms use those tools. Really, really easy, obviously, to maintain. But nowadays, it is more common to use some kind of electronic software solution. There are, a few products out there. I'm keen on electronic products for many reasons. One is it just makes your life a lot simpler. If you've got electronic checklists, you've got your records saved on the internet, backed up by a server, hopefully in the UK. And of course, I probably should disclose an interest, as my company does have a product called Compliance Caddy, but there's quite a few of them out there. I certainly think it's a good idea to go electronic, because you're going to save yourself a lot of time, and you can't lose documents when you're using electronic solutions.
Yeah, I mean, even with the hybrid teams nowadays, it's almost impossible for everyone to have access to up-to-date stuff if it's not online and if it's not in the cloud. If people are still using paper files, then everybody's not going to have access to the same information. So yeah, obviously we come at it as Osprey from a tech approach too, but it just makes sense, and it's just easy, and saves that sort of resource time if everyone can access those up-to-date things. And it's not all about the tech, but it's how it's being used. So I guess coming back to your point about those processes, and are things done as they are expected to do, what steps can firms take to create a culture of compliance within their firms that involves both lawyers, support staff, management? Because it's that culture that's going to have an effect on the behaviours and habits that the team have.
Yeah, I think what management have to do is to emphasise that they have an open culture. So a staff should be praised for raising problems rather than burying them. It's very tempting, of course, to try and bury a problem, but then you're only pushing the problem further down the road, and it's going to get bigger. So really should have an open culture. And I also found it quite odd when I first moved from Marks and Spencer to the Legal Aid Board and started visiting law firms. I noticed then, it's a little bit better now, but it still isn't perfect. You have this kind of 2-tier culture. So you have kind of lawyers up here and then support staff down there. And that's poor, really. I think support staff should be given the same status as a fee earner. And of course, I gave that example about the Gurkhas a few minutes ago. So support staff are really, really valuable. And I should point out, because not every lawyer is aware of this, because most lawyers don't come into contact with the SRA. But I should point out that the way the SRA approach all of this is to prefer firms to take a mere culpa attitude when problems are discovered, and then implement measures to prevent the same problems happening again. And Amy, if I may, to go back to the previous question answer, you mentioned Teams, and many people hadn't used Teams before the pandemic. And I think it's really important to learn all the different features of Teams, because not everybody's aware of the things you can do. So one kind of neat thing that we use is where you kind of share a document on Teams and then work on it, and then you can see what somebody's done. So I'd strongly encourage people to look at all of the different features of Teams, and also Zoom. There are some pretty advanced stuff in both of those tools.
Yeah, I think actually when you talk about tech, people tend to lean to the newest, shiniest thing, and gosh, do we need this new bit of software, or are we missing out? But actually, it's normally the basics that people aren't using to their advantage or aren't utilizing fully that can actually have such a big impact on how people work day to day.
Yeah.
So yeah, leaning into going back to the culture of compliance and having that open culture, and people being able to raise problems or ask questions if they need to make sure that they're following what they should. It is absolutely key to making sure that everyone's pulling in the same direction, is following the same behaviours. And yeah, I guess it goes back to that brand as well. The more everyone's sort of, pulling to the same values, the more that compliance is going to be prioritised throughout the firm, and not just one person's responsibility, and not just a tick exercise that was mentioned previously. So in order to get that culture and to get those values throughout the business, what advice would you give to management or compliance officers to effectively communicate and enforce those policies throughout the firm?
Well, I think one thing that I learned from my first experience, my first kind of real proper job in Abbey National, is that all of the banks and building societies at that time, probably still do, used to have a weekly training morning, which might last for, say, 30 minutes. So one day of the week, with us, I think it was Wednesday, the branch would open 30 minutes later. And I always thought that was good for staff morale, and it showed that the building societies, it was then, took training seriously. So that works. And we do this at DG Legal every Monday morning. And what we do is we'll have an hour's training. That might be face-to-face, or it might be a webinar, and then up to 30 minutes for discussion. So what we're doing at the moment is looking at all of the different sessions at the SRA Compliance Officers Conference. So what they do every year is they have a big face-to-face conference, and then a couple of weeks later they'll do a virtual one. So I went to the face-to-face one, and I'm just making sure that the staff are seeing all of the virtual ones. And again, I think that's it's good. It's good for their knowledge. It's good for their skills, etc. And I know they enjoy that. The other thing I would say is firms should go wider than simply setting fee earning targets when appraising staff, etc. I think it's good to include other metrics as well. So, for example, good file review results, responsiveness to clients, and also include client feedback scores on Google, Trustpilot, and review solicitors. Certainly in our organisation, the two main metrics are responsiveness and Google reviews. So I think that's, as I mentioned earlier, very, very important.
I love that idea of the training morning, because like you said, not only is that a chance for everyone to get together and learn something new as a group, but also it shows that you prioritize that as a business leader, that you see that as important and you see that as key to the success of the business. And I think a lot of culture has to come from the top. It has to be led and modeled by the leaders within a business or a firm. It doesn't matter what industry you're in.
I was thinking about if I was a law firm and I was caught in the AML regulated sector, such as conveyancing, for instance, I think what I would do, and I think I'll probably do this as a webinar, in fact, I'm sure I'll do this as a webinar, is just have various scenarios, and I would want to ask the staff, particularly the lawyers, what AML checks do they need to undertake, just to hammer home the point that it's not the same for every client, etc. So come up with, say, 5 different scenarios, and I think the way we would do it with a webinar is we'd get the audience to vote about what checks they need to undertake, etc. AML is undoubtedly the most important compliance topic of the moment, and with very good reason, because it's a very serious topic. Not so serious, but particularly because of the fines, then it would be the transparency rules.
Yeah, great point on that. I like that, training doesn't have to just be sit in a classroom and listen to somebody or sit on a webinar. It can be workshopping and, inspiring each other to come up with new and improved ways. This isn't just about, doing the things we've always done. It's about making sure we're doing it at the best we can and continuously improving. Going back to your point on measuring different things. So aligning your success measures to the outcomes you want in your business. And crucially, that also means aligning your success measures with your values. So if you're valuing and prioritizing compliance, then those measures need to be within the success measures of your appraisals and of your team reviews. And I love that idea of linking it to the Google reviews and client feedback, because that just then makes you also very client focused. So I think that's a brilliant piece of advice there. So there's been a lot of sort of talk about the influence of sort of non-legal employees in the sector or non-legal law firm leaders, and the sort of rise in the ABS model of law firms. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on, what do you think the impact of having non-legal employees in a firm are? I guess also not coming from a direct legal background originally for yourself as well. What do you think the impact is?
Well, I've already said that the receptionist and telephone answerer is one of the most important persons in a law firm. I think the impact of ABS has been positive. Many alternative business structure firms have an experienced business leader or an entrepreneur or an accountant in a senior management team, and this adds to the diversity of experience in a law firm. And one of the things that I found quite odd when I moved into the legal sector is that the people, certainly when I started my business in 2000, way before ABS has existed, I did find it quite odd that almost every senior partner and all of the kind of management team had known nothing else other than law. They'd started off as a trainee solicitor, for instance, and they'd done what they used to call their articles, and no real business experience outside of the legal sector. And I think that's why we've seen in the legal sector, unlike, for example, the tech sector or the bank sector or the insurance sector, there isn't the level of skills in management has not really been at the same level as those other sectors. And I think ABS has helped to move that into a much better direction. And one thing that I found really interesting a few weeks ago, I went to the International Bar Association conference in Paris, and I was asking about ABSs in other countries, and that it's banned in most countries. There's only a few countries, or even I think a few states in the United States that allow it, and the reason why it's banned in most countries is simply because of the lobbying of the lawyers themselves. They think that if there's going to be non-lawyer owners or managers, etc., then maybe the ethics aren't going to be quite as high. And I kind of think that we've seen in England over the last 12 years or so, that's just hasn't been the case. I think ABSs can be quite entrepreneurial, and certainly our experience of helping new law firms, particularly ABSs, is that they've flowered. I almost said floundered. So yeah, I think it's been a really, really good thing. And I also think that getting or recruiting experienced operational managers from other sectors can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I was talking to your colleague, Sarah Charlton, who's also a consultant at DG Legal, in a previous webinar, and she was saying that at her firm, it's a priority for her, especially in non-legal roles and customer facing, customer experience roles, that she looks outside of the sector, because there's these client focused, client centric brands, these big brands that we all know, that have great views on that and they can push that forward. So yeah, it's a priority for her when looking for those roles to actually look outside. So yeah, I think she'd very much agree with you there. So looking to the future and making sure that law firms are staying proactive. We're going to touch back on the point you mentioned earlier about a key challenge is just keeping up to date with everything. What are your tips for ensuring that the evolving requirements and strategies and all that are kept up to date with?
Well, I would subscribe to various bulletins and read practice notes. Some are free, such as the SRA's compliance bulletin, which I think is very good. There's also the Law Society's practice note service. There's, of course, helplines run by both the SRA and the Law Society. Some private companies go further and provide templates and detailed advice on how to comply. So, for example, you can pay certain company for their practice compliance service and you'll get all these kind of notes and templates. Similarly, we do something similar for our own clients. I'd also consider budding up with other firms to share experiences and best practice. I'd be wary of those that are scaremongering. I remember when the court roll came out and there was some people out there saying it's a full-time job, which is absolute nonsense. Might be if you're a massive law firm, perhaps, but for the vast majority of law firms, it's not. And once you have a system in place, it really shouldn't take very much of your time to maintain the corp and the code for roles, etc. It really isn't that hard once you have a system in place.
Yeah, so having those fundamentals in place, those checklists and processes that you mentioned earlier, and the tools to help you make that much easier. And then just dedicating enough time, I guess, and knowing where to go. Obviously, DG Legal, you yourself have plenty of webinars, free and paid for, to help you out with those and templates and things. I think that's great advice. How do you foresee the future of legal compliance evolving? What is it that SME firms should be preparing or looking out for the future?
Well, I don't want to overlabor the point, but it's certainly true that AML will get more complicated and law firms will be expected by not only the SRA, but government as well to improve their performance. For instance, the SRA's annual AML report, 22 to 23, noted that many firms had inadequate risk assessments, policies, controls and procedures, and inadequate supervision or training. The SRA gave the example that firms were using templates that didn't necessarily suit their own law firm. So there was one embarrassing example where a firm had copied and pasted a risk assessment and it had categories of law they didn't even practice. So yeah, I mean it's really important to do that. And I mentioned earlier about having firm-wide risk assessments. You also have to do client to matter risk assessments where you're looking at, what risk involved is taken on that client in that particular instruction, and you have to do that at the outset and keep thinking about it throughout the lifetime of the case. I also think understanding firms' responsibilities with regard to financial sanctions is also key. There's recently been a questionnaire sent out to a lot of firms. And I think I've already mentioned previously that the majority of law firms don't fully comply with the SRA's transparency rules, and the SRA have lost patience. And now is the time to really nail that down and make sure that you understand it. It's not a long read. It's only about, I think it's like 5 or 6 pages, the SRA transparency rules. It's not difficult to understand. So I think that would be a key priority.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess your point prior where you said that it's not necessarily a full-time job depending on the size of your firm is actually quite reassuring. I think a lot of the time compliance is very high pressure. It's very scary, but that felt reassuring to me anyway. So hopefully it was reassuring to our audience that actually once you've got the fundamentals in, it then gives you time to prioritize those key 3 things that you mentioned that are evolving now and super important to help you avoid those SRA fines that are unnecessary, but also make sure that it aligns with your brand and you're keeping your reputation and your brand on track, and putting the right behaviors and habits and tools in place. So thank you so much, David, for your knowledge and experience in helping our audience stay compliant and mitigate risk. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
That's my pleasure. Thank you, Amy.